When William Wallace was captured, they didn't seek justice, they demanded humiliation. What followed was one of the most methodically cruel executions in history. The man who once defied an empire was dragged, disemboweled, and carved apart limb by limb while the crowd was told to watch, remember, and fear. To the English crown, William Wallace was a traitor, but to his people, he was something else entirely, a symbol of rage born from oppression. A name whispered in the winds of rebellion. His crime wasn't betrayal. It wasn't murder. It wasn't even war. It was defiance, the kind that couldn't be bought, broken, or erased. And for that, he would suffer a death so cruel, so engineered, it would become legend. Wallace's rise began in shadows. A minor noble, possibly born around 1270. He came of age during a time when Scotland's sovereignty teetered on the edge of erasure. After the death of King Alexander III and the subsequent chaos of succession, Edward I of England, a man known as the Hammer of the Scots, moved in to assert control. What followed wasn't a partnership. It was conquest. English soldiers flooded the land. Castles were seized. Laws rewritten. Scottish nobles bent the knee, one after another. But Wallace did not. He emerged as a leader not through title or inheritance, but through sheer will. In 1297, he led a surprise attack against the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, a victory that shattered the illusion of English invincibility. It wasn't just a military win. It was a declaration. Scotland would not go quietly. Yet, that victory painted a target on Wallace's back. Edward I, humiliated and enraged, vowed revenge. The king unleashed a brutal campaign to crush Scottish resistance, and Wallace, now guardian of Scotland, became enemy number one. But despite their efforts, he slipped through their fingers again and again. He was not a soldier in an army. He was a ghost in the hills, striking, vanishing, surviving. Still, time turned against him. By 1305, Wallace had been betrayed. Some say it was Sir John de Menteith, a fellow Scot, who handed him over near Glasgow, captured and dragged in chains. To London, he was paraded through English towns as if his very body were an exhibit. And though the outcome had already been decided, a mock trial was arranged not to determine guilt, but to announce it. He was brought before a tribunal at Westminster Hall, still shackled, his clothes ragged from weeks in captivity. The charges: treason against the crown, murder, rebellion. Wallace stood silent as they read each one, and when finally given a chance to speak, he said only this: "I could not be a traitor, for I was never his subject." It was not just defiance, it was truth. Wallace had never sworn loyalty to Edward. He had fought not as a rogue, but as a man defending his homeland from invasion. But logic had no place in this courtroom. The sentence had already been etched in the king's mind long before Wallace crossed the border. He would not be merely executed. He would be dismantled in front of the very people he had once inspired. The ritual was designed not to end his life quickly, but to destroy the myth of William Wallace, to turn flesh into warning, to make an example so horrific, so theatrical, that no Scot would ever again dream of resistance. But they miscalculated, because the cruelty they planned to erase his legacy would instead become its foundation. And as the crowd gathered at Smithfield to watch a death no one deserved, they would soon realize they weren't just there to witness punishment. They were there to witness horror, handcrafted by a king. When Edward I ordered the execution of William Wallace, it wasn't to silence a rebel, it was to rewrite a nation's memory. This was not punishment. It was propaganda, a carefully staged performance designed to mutilate more than just a body. It was meant to carve fear into the bones of every Scot who might one day rise. The crown didn't just want Wallace dead, it wanted to unmake him. The sentence was pronounced with brutal clarity. Wallace would be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment so deliberately savage that even among the cruelty of medieval executions, it stood out as exceptional. But for a man like Wallace, Edward wanted every stage to be amplified, exaggerated, and witnessed. The execution was scheduled for August 23, 1305. The location: Smithfield, just outside London's walls, a flat, open field perfect for crowds. Because this death was not for justice, it was for show. They began with a procession, if it could be called that. Wallace was stripped naked, his feet and wrists bound with iron, and tied behind a horse, not ridden, not walk-dragged, through the filthy streets of London. For miles, his body scraped over cobblestones, through mud, and past jeering citizens. The message was clear: this man, once a commander, would be delivered to death not as a warrior but as refused at Smithfield. The crowd was already waiting. Nobles, merchants, commoners, they'd all come to see the king's vengeance take form. Many had never seen Wallace, only heard the stories. The tall, fierce warrior who had defeated English armies, who had burned garrisons and vanished into the mist, but what they saw was a man half dead already, bloodied, bruised, bones likely broken from the journey, yet in his eyes no plea, no surrender. The execution began with the hanging. Wallace was hoisted by the neck until his body began to convulse, his skin turning a sickening shade of blue as air left his lungs. But death would not be permitted, not yet. Before unconsciousness could take him, he was cut down, gasping, choking, barely conscious. The crowd roared, not in joy, but in disbelief. The spectacle had only begun. Next came the drawing, not just in the physical sense, but in the most horrifying ritual of English execution. Wallace was tied to a wooden table or platform, his arms and legs secured, fully exposed. A knife appeared, short, sharp, ceremonial. With it, the executioner cut deep into Wallace's abdomen, slicing through muscle, through organs, all while Wallace remained alive. His bowels were pulled from his body, spilling onto the platform, and yet still he breathed. And then came the most grotesque flourish. His genitals were severed and burned before his eyes. This was not just cruelty, it was symbolic erasure. To kill the man was not enough, they needed to emasculate him, to destroy the legacy of his bloodline, of his masculinity, of his resistance. Smoke from the fire rose into the sky as Wallace, somehow still conscious, watched his body become a weapon against his name. The crowd, initially gleeful, began to shift. Some turned away, some wept. This was no longer a performance. It was suffering laid bare, a human being transformed into a canvas of torment, and still no scream. Witnesses claimed that Wallace never begged, never cried out, only clenched his jaw and locked his gaze on the horizon, as if looking far beyond the men who destroyed him. And then, finally, came the beheading, the moment meant to seal it all. The sword rose and fell, severing his head from his shoulders. Blood poured in rivers, but the worst had already been done. The head would be boiled and placed on a spike above London Bridge, his limbs sent to four corners of the kingdom: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, so that every town would remember. This wasn't justice, it was dismemberment of history itself. But even in death, Wallace's body refused to vanish, and what came next was something no king could control: the legend. After the blood was washed from Smithfield and Wallace's remains scattered like a warning across the corners of England, the crown believed the rebellion had been buried with the man. What they didn't anticipate was how death could magnify defiance. The public display had been meant to erase him. Instead, it etched him into memory with fire. His head, boiled and blackened, loomed above London Bridge. Travelers entering the city were greeted not by banners or saints, but by the grim face of a man who had dared to say no. No to English law, no to forced allegiance, no to a king who thought himself God. It wasn't a deterrent, it was a monument. And in the towns where his limbs were nailed to gates: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, his absence became presence. Locals gathered beneath the grisly trophies, not in fear, but in mourning. The crown had underestimated the Scots. Wallace's mutilation did not terrify them, it solidified him. Stories spread, carried by traders and whispered through forests. He had not died a traitor, they said he had died a martyr, a man who faced death without begging, without weeping, without bending. Songs were written in secret. Tales exaggerated his strength, his last words, the steadiness of his breath as his organs were pulled from his body. Myth wrapped itself around the wound, and what England had tried to destroy became folklore. But the legend wasn't just about Wallace's endurance, it was about what he had stood against. Edward I, the so-called hammer of the Scots, had built his empire on conquest and fear, But fear is brittle. The more he tightened his grip, the more cracks appeared in his dominion. Wallace's execution had been meant to remind the Scots of their place. Instead, it reminded them of their loss and gave them a name to rally behind. Even English chroniclers couldn't erase what they saw. The spectacle at Smithfield was recorded in grim detail by men who had no sympathy for Wallace's cause, yet could not deny the horror. They described the crowd's discomfort, the gasps, the way some turned away, how a silence fell not reverent, but stunned when the executioner pulled the entrails from Wallace's living body. These weren't just notes on paper, they were warnings, accounts of a cruelty that had crossed a line even for a blood-soaked age. And then came the irony. Edward I, who believed he had crushed rebellion once and for all, would die just 2 years later, never seeing the Scotland he tried to break return to fight again. His son, Edward II, inherited both the throne and the consequences of that brutality. The Scots, far from subdued, surged back under a new banner, Robert the Bruce, and in 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, they would deliver a defeat to the English so decisive, it would shake the very foundations of English power in the north. And in the chants of those warriors, in the war cries and prayers uttered before battle, one name was said more than any other: Wallace, because Wallace had not been erased. He had been transformed, from rebel to martyr, from outlaw to symbol. The English had destroyed his body, yes, but they had failed to destroy his purpose, and sometimes purpose is more dangerous than flesh. But Wallace's story didn't end. With war or revenge, it lived on through centuries, rattled, reshaped, and resurrected. And what happened next wasn't just myth-making. It was a battle over memory itself. Long after William Wallace's limbs decayed on foreign gates, his name still walked through Scotland like a phantom. He had no tomb, no shrine, no grave to kneel beside, yet he became more real in death than he had ever been in life. But this was no accident. Wallace didn't vanish. He evolved. Piece by piece, the man was turned into myth, his agony into parable, and his dismembered body into a symbol too powerful to bury. In the decades that followed his execution, Wallace's story was shaped not by kings or clergy, but by the people. It started with whispers of his final moments, of his defiance at the gallows, of his supposed last words. Then came the poets, the balladeers, and the monks with ink-stained fingers, who preserved his name in fragments of verse and furious prose. The most famous of these was Blind Harry, a 15th-century minstrel whose epic poem, The Wallace, transformed historical truth into nationalist scripture. According to Blind Harry, Wallace wasn't just brave, he was unstoppable. He wielded a sword so large only giants could lift it. He single-handedly slaughtered English battalions, escaped impossible traps, and stood untouched by fear. These were embellishments, of course, but they served a deeper purpose. Wallace became less about fact and more about identity. In a fractured land with no central crown, no true sovereignty, Wallace offered something even more vital: continuity. A man the people could own, whose suffering became a mirror for their own. His myth became a form of resistance, long after the battlefield had gone quiet. But even in England, the shadow of his death lingered. Royal chroniclers rarely discussed Wallace in depth, often reducing him to a brigand or a barbarian. Yet the severity of his execution was difficult to ignore. His trial records, preserved in royal archives, described each stage of torment with chilling precision. The sentence to be hanged, drawn, and quartered alive was not reserved for common outlaws. It was for enemies who had shaken the very core of English pride. And Wallace had done just that. Generations of Scots who read these accounts didn't see them as proof of guilt. They saw them as proof of fear, the English crown's terror of what Wallace represented. Not a man, but an idea. That sovereignty didn't belong to empires. It belonged to the people. And over time, that idea metastasized. During the Scottish Reformation, Wallace was remembered as a freedom fighter against both Rome and England. In the Enlightenment, he was invoked as a symbol of rational resistance to tyranny. By the 19th century, as industrialization and political unrest swept Europe, Wallace was no longer just Scottish, he was universal. A man torn apart for daring to rise above his station. Statues were raised, streets were named, speeches given. Every detail of his suffering, once designed to destroy him, now gave him shape. Artists painted him in royal hues. Writers turned his dying words into rallying cries. And when Scotland's national identity needed anchoring, they turned not to kings, but to the executed outlaw. But with every new generation came a challenge. Where did the man end and the myth begin? Could anyone still find the historical Wallace beneath the layers of legend? That question would drive scholars, politicians, and even skeptics to peel back the centuries. And what they would uncover next wasn't just a story, it was a battleground of memory. Because Wallace's legacy wasn't just being remembered, it was being fought over. And the war for his image was only beginning. Centuries after his execution, William Wallace's remains were still missing, but now it was his legacy that lay in pieces. The myth had grown enormous, larger than any battlefield he fought on, larger than any army he led. But myths are dangerous, things too easy to bend, too tempting to claim. And soon, Wallace wasn't just a hero. He was a political weapon. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as Britain shifted from monarchy to empire, Wallace's story was caught in the churn of nationalism. To some, he was a symbol of Scottish pride, an eternal reminder that independence was not just a dream, but a blood-marked reality. To others, especially English historians, he was still a traitor, an outlaw who had threatened the unity of the island before unity had even existed. Academics began to peel back the romantic verses of Blind Harry, dissecting the myth with cold detachment. They questioned the timeline of Wallace's battles, the accuracy of his speeches, even the legitimacy of his title as Guardian of Scotland. In scholarly circles, Wallace became a puzzle, fragmented, inconsistent, maddeningly elusive. They searched for the man beneath the martyr, and in doing so, accidentally mirrored the same violence done to his body centuries earlier. Yet this new dissection wasn't fueled by cruelty, it was desperation. Everyone wanted to own Wallace. Historians, nationalists, royals, and rebels. The English crown had tried to erase him. The Scottish nobility had once abandoned him. But now, political parties, protest groups, and governments sought to sculpt his image to fit their needs. In the early 1800s, as Scottish identity surged in defiance of English dominance, monuments to Wallace began appearing across the landscape. The most famous of these, the Wallace Monument, was completed in 1869 near Stirling, the site of his greatest victory. Towering to 120 feet, it became a new kind of battlefield, one of memory. Inside, a sword said to belong to Wallace was displayed. Behind glass, its authenticity debated, its symbolism undeniable. Tourists flocked to it. School children memorized his name. Speeches were held beneath its shadow. But even here, a fracture remained. Some criticized the monument's Victorian flair, its Gothic spires, its romantic stonework, arguing it honored not Wallace the man, but Wallace the myth. Others didn't care. What mattered was that he still stood. Meanwhile, writers like Sir Walter Scott continued to elevate Wallace as a literary icon, while others sought to reclaim his humanity. They wrote of his early life, his possible marriage, his grief after his father's death at the hands of English troops. In these retellings, he wasn't just a warrior. He was a man driven by loss, a wound that bled into rebellion. Yet with every retelling, something was lost. Was Wallace a revolutionary, a nationalist, a terrorist, a liberator? The truth was, he was all of them and none. But that ambiguity made him even more dangerous, because a martyr whose cause is unfinished can be summoned again and again. And so he was. From 20th century independence movements to modern referendums, Wallace's name was shouted in Parliament halls and whispered in pubs. His image appeared on posters, coins, protest signs. He became a point of tension between Scotland's future and its fractured past. But if Wallace's body had been quartered across a kingdom, his legacy was now quartered across ideologies, each side clinging to a version of him, forgetting the simple truth. He had not died to become a symbol. He had died because he refused to kneel. And the deeper historians dug, the more they realized beneath the layers of myth, blood, and politics there still beat the heart of a man, one whose silence at the scaffold said more than any legend ever could. Smithfield, August 23, 1305. By midday, the sun bore down on a sea of tightly packed bodies. Londoners had turned out in the thousands. Some were drawn by curiosity, others by cruelty. A few came simply because they were told to witness the dismantling of a man who had dared to defy the English crown. But none of them were prepared for what they would see, a death designed not to end a life, but to perform it. William Wallace was brought forward in chains, nearly unrecognizable after days of imprisonment and the agonizing 4-mile drag through London streets. His body was bruised, torn, barely upright, but his face, what was left of it, carried no apology, no submission. He did not stumble. He did not beg. That alone unsettled the crowd. They expected a broken man. What they got was one who refused to die afraid. The stage for his death had been meticulously prepared. The wooden platform, slick with sweat and anticipation. The block, the fire pit, the instruments, knives, hooks, ropes, and irons carefully arranged like tools of a master craftsman. This was not an execution. This was a statement from a king. Etched in blood and agony, the hanging was first. Wallace was strung up by the neck until his face purpled, eyes bulging, legs twitching. But the goal was never death, only the edge of it. Just as his body began to sag limp, they cut the rope. He crumpled to the ground, gasping, choking, retching bile, still conscious, still aware. The first act was complete. Then came the drawing. They tied him to a board, spread his arms and legs wide, and began the mutilation. With surgical precision, the executioner sliced open Wallace's abdomen. His entrails were slowly, deliberately pulled from his body. Witnesses wrote that the crowd, so raucous before, fell nearly silent. Some vomited, others fainted. Even the most hardened soldiers looked away. The executioner didn't rush. He had been ordered to prolong the pain, to stretch every second, and Wallace never screamed. That detail appears again and again in records. He never cried out. His jaw clenched, his eyes locked forward. It was not bravado, it was defiance, and in that silence, the crowd heard everything the crown feared. Next came the symbolic blow. His genitals were cut off and burned before his fading eyes. This was no mere mutilation, it was obliteration of legacy, of masculinity, of any claim to lineage. The fire hissed, flesh sizzled, the stench filled the square. Wallace's body writhed, but his spirit refused to collapse. Finally, the executioner reached into Wallace's chest and tore out his heart. Accounts vary on whether he was still fully conscious in those final seconds. But even if the body was fading, the moment remained etched into every face in that crowd. The heart was held aloft, then thrown into the flames as if burning it could extinguish everything Wallace had ignited. The beheading came almost as an afterthought. His head, now just flesh and memory, was severed cleanly and placed atop London Bridge. His limbs were packed in tar and shipped to distant cities, displayed on gates and walls as if they were stolen relics of a war god fallen from grace. But the king's performance had a flaw. You can destroy a man. You can burn his name, scatter his bones, make children afraid of him. But when you turn his death into theater, you invite the audience to remember. And what they remembered wasn't a traitor gasping for forgiveness. It was a man who met dismemberment with silence, and that silence would echo for centuries until Wallace's name could no longer be ignored, only resurrected. The death of William Wallace should have been the end of his story. That was the plan. Shatter the body, scatter the pieces, burn the remnants. But while kings may command executions, they cannot command forgetting. And as the flames died and Wallace's limbs rotted on distant walls, his absence began to speak louder than his breath ever had. London Bridge bore his head for years. The spike that held it aloft rusted with rain and blood. Merchants passed beneath it daily. Children pointed. Foreign dignitaries looked up and saw not justice, but a warning one that raised a troubling question. If this was what the English crown did to a man who defied them, what cruelty might they unleash on those who merely disagreed? Yet even more disturbing than the display was what followed, the complete disappearance of his remains. Wallace's body was never recovered. His bones were never gathered. No tomb marks his resting place. He was erased, unatomized into political theater, and lost to the wind. To the English, it was closure. To the Scots, it was a wound that never closed. And over time, the fact that there was no grave became its own form of martyrdom. People need places to grieve, shrines to remember. Wallace gave them neither, or rather, the crown denied them that right, and so the land itself became the mourner. His name was scratched into stones, whispered in prayers, carved into the beams of old churches. Folklore claimed that his heart was never burned at all, that a sympathetic guard stole it and buried it in secret. Others believed his spirit haunted the walls of Smithfield, where the grass refused to grow for decades. Historians searched for clues. The execution records were clear on process, but vague on aftermath. There were no burial accounts, no ceremonial notes, nothing but the catalog of suffering. Some speculated his torso had been cremated. Others believed it was dumped into the Thames like so much waste. But every theory only deepened the unease. How could a man who had moved a nation leave no trace behind? And so, instead of a grave, Scotland built memory. In the centuries that followed, Wallace's story was kept alive not by stones, but by voices. Rural families told their children of his resistance. Clergy offered sermons on the nature of sacrifice. Soldiers invoked his name before battle. The man who had no resting place now rested in the minds of the people. But even that memory was not safe. As political tides shifted, new rulers sought to control Wallace's image. Some rebranded him as a nationalist visionary. Others reduced him to a footnote, one rebel among many. Textbooks altered the language, museums curated carefully, omitting the gruesome details. There were those who feared what might happen if Wallace's full story was told with all its gore, courage, and defiance intact, because Wallace's death wasn't simply brutal, it was deliberate. It was a ritual designed by a king who understood that spectacle is power, and power, once questioned, is never fully safe again. Yet despite every attempt to sanitize his tale, the echoes always returned, because when a body is burned, forgotten, and scattered and yet remembered across generations, what you've created is no longer a man. It's a legend with a pulse, and the legend of Wallace was not done rising. In fact, it was about to be reborn in a form that would eclipse even the crown that had once killed him. Centuries passed, and still, there was no tombstone for William Wallace, only the scattered memories of a man too dangerous to be buried. But history has a strange way of reviving its ghosts, especially those silenced by violence, and Wallace, the outlaw once dragged and quartered, began to reappear, not in the battlefield, but in something even more powerful, the public imagination. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Scotland was changing. Industrial cities were rising, empires expanding, but along with progress came an identity crisis. What did it mean to be Scottish under the shadow of British rule? In that vacuum, figures of the past returned, and none loomed larger than Wallace, not because of new evidence, but because he had become useful again. The myth, long preserved in whispers and ballads, was now picked up by writers, poets, and political thinkers. They didn't just tell his story, they reshaped it. Wallace became the patron saint of Scottish resistance, not just to Edward I, but to every form of foreign control. He was molded to fit the needs of each new generation, a freedom fighter, a symbol of democracy, even a proto-nationalist centuries ahead of his time. Blind Harry's 15th century epic, The Wallace, was dusted off and printed anew. Though wildly exaggerated, its verses rekindled national pride. Tourists sought out places he had once walked. Scholars debated his lineage. Sculptors and architects were commissioned. And in 1869, the most dramatic act of resurrection occurred. The Wallace Monument, towering above the countryside near Stirling. It was more than a memorial, it was a defiance carved in stone. Rising to 120 feet into the sky, it claimed the high ground both literally and symbolically. It said, Wallace was real. Wallace mattered. Wallace endured. Inside, relics were displayed. Most notably, a massive sword, over 5 feet in length, said to have belonged to Wallace himself. Whether or not it truly did was irrelevant. What mattered was the belief it inspired. Children looked up in awe. Veterans saluted. Artists sketched. The man who had been denied a grave now had a tower. The man whose limbs had once hung in shame now stood taller than kings. But as the legend grew, so did the contradictions. Some historians warned of romanticizing Wallace beyond recognition. They pointed out inaccuracies in the popular tales. They challenged the timeline of battles, the existence of certain speeches, the scale of his heroism, but their corrections fell flat because Wallace was no longer subject to the cold dissection of facts. He was alive in memory, and memory plays by different rules. That memory found new fuel in art and cinema. In 1995, Mel Gibson's Braveheart brought Wallace to the global stage. Though historically flawed, the film reignited passion in ways no textbook ever could. Blue war paint, roaring battle cries, and the final word, freedom, etched him permanently into the minds of a modern audience. It was a version of Wallace tailored for Hollywood, but beneath the dramatics, the core remained, a man who refused to kneel, and it worked. In the years that followed, political leaders invoked his name during independence debates. Flags bore his image, murals appeared on walls. The man England had tried to erase now had more faces than ever before. But with resurrection came danger. For every hero made immortal, there is a temptation to use him, and Wallace, once executed to kill an idea, was now being weaponized to serve others. Nationalists, revolutionaries, and opportunists alike claimed him. Some honored his defiance, others twisted it, yet through it all, one truth remained unshaken, no matter how many times his body was burned, scattered, or distorted. William Wallace could not be forgotten, and what followed next would reveal the full cost of keeping a dead man alive in the minds of the living. As Scotland marched into the modern age, William Wallace remained its most potent relic, a ghost that refused to fade, but also refused to conform. His image was everywhere, yet no one fully agreed on what he meant anymore. That's the burden of a legend. Once it belongs to everyone, it can be twisted by anyone. In the 20th century, the Scottish independence movement surged and faltered in cycles. With every rise came a wave of invocations, Wallace in speeches, Wallace in banners, Wallace as a silent endorsement from history itself. But the real man was long gone. What remained was a skeleton rebuilt from fragments, molded by desire, and paraded through the corridors of power. Politicians quoted his name. Activists painted his likeness. Protesters wore his symbol like armor. But for some, the use of Wallace felt less like honor and more like appropriation. The brutality of his death, the agony of his execution, they weren't metaphors. They were real. And to reduce that to a soundbite was to ignore the cost. Still, Wallace's symbolic power was undeniable. During the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, his spirit was conjured repeatedly. Campaigners waved the saltire beside murals of his face. Street performers dressed as medieval warriors. Children reenacted his battles in school halls. Yet for all the pageantry, something darker lingered beneath the surface. Because when a nation builds itself on the memory of a martyr, it also inherits his wounds. And Wallace's wounds were never healed. Historians and cultural critics began to ask, had Scotland become dependent on Wallace? Had he become a crutch instead of a compass? Was his story empowering a new generation or anchoring them to a past soaked in blood and loss? The questions were uncomfortable, but they mattered, because Wallace had never fought for symbolic victory. He fought for survival, raw, immediate, and uncompromising. His death wasn't poetry, it was pain, stretched out across hours and stitched together with iron. And the more his image was polished, the more the truth of that suffering risked being forgotten. Meanwhile, in England, Wallace's memory remained thorny. He was still listed as a traitor in official records. His execution was still described clinically. Without remorse, there were no memorials to his name, no apologies issued, no reconsideration of what had been done. The state that dismembered him had never attempted to reassemble the truth. That silence spoke volumes. Yet even in this tension, Wallace's legend continued to evolve. Artists reimagined him, writers reframed him, playwrights gave him new voices. And across continents, freedom fighters invoked his name not because they knew his story, but because they understood his silence. He became not just a Scottish hero, but a global symbol for those whose defiance ended in chains. From South American revolutionaries to African resistance leaders, Wallace was invoked not for what he said, but for what he endured. He was proof that the body could be broken, but not the idea. But with every invocation, another thread pulled at the fabric of his legacy. Could one man carry so many meanings? Could a ghost so bloodied and brutalized still guide the living? The answer was not simple. Because Wallace wasn't a guide. He was a reminder, a warning of what happens when a ruler fears resistance more than injustice, a shadow cast by gallows and fire. And for Scotland, he was a question still unresolved. And that question would only find its answer when the final truth about Wallace's death and what it truly meant was finally faced without myth. William Wallace did not die with dignity. He died in pieces, dragged, hanged, gutted, castrated, beheaded, and dismembered before a crowd. The execution wasn't swift, it wasn't silent, and it wasn't meant to be forgotten. It was designed to terrorize, to rip apart not just a man but a movement. And yet, more than 7 centuries later, that savage ritual has become the foundation of a paradox. The more they tore him apart, the more unbreakable he became. To understand Wallace's death is to understand power at its most insecure. Edward, I had won battles, crushed castles, and manipulated crowns. But Wallace was different. Wallace represented something the king could not dominate, an idea that existed outside palaces, beyond parchment, an idea born in fields and whispered in homes. That freedom did not need permission. That's why Wallace's body was not merely destroyed, it was obliterated with intent. No grave, no funeral, no marker. His flesh was scattered like a threat, not to punish Wallace, but to haunt those who remembered him. The king believed that by removing Wallace from the earth, he could remove him from memory. He could not have been more wrong. In death, Wallace transformed. He became not just a figure of rebellion, but a permanent reminder that empires rot when they rule by fear. His execution showed the lengths a crown would go to silence opposition, but it also revealed the fragility of that power, because despite the spectacle, it is not the king's name etched into hearts across generations. It is Wallace's. His story has lived longer than the monarch who killed him. It has crossed borders, languages, and cultures. His legend has become both inspiration and warning, proof that history can weaponize memory just as violently as swords once sliced through flesh. But perhaps most disturbing is how easily his suffering can be forgotten in the glow of his myth. Tourists stand in gift shops near the Wallace Monument, buying t-shirts and canes, laughing beneath his statue. Braveheart battle reenactments draw cheers. Yet the truth of Wallace's final hours, the agony of disembowelment, the public display of his severed limbs, that truth is rarely spoken aloud. It's uncomfortable, inconvenient, easier to remember. The warrior than the man who was tied down and slowly dismantled while hundreds watched. But if we remember Wallace without remembering his pain, we repeat the mistake of those who thought him a mere symbol, because his suffering was not a metaphor. It was real, and the executioner's blade didn't silence him, it exposed the brutality of the system that demanded such horror. Therein lies the final irony. Edward I crafted Wallace's death to be unforgettable, and he succeeded, but not in the way he intended. The spectacle meant to shatter resistance, instead gave it shape. The ritual meant to erase a rebel, instead birthed a legend. Every time someone speaks Wallace's name, that legend grows stronger. And every time someone forgets the price he paid, the gallows creak again in history's memory. Because Wallace's story is not just a relic, it is a warning that power can destroy the body, dismember the man, and burn the bones, but it cannot kill what stands for truth. And somewhere in the silence between myth and memory, his last breath still echoes.